I want to make sure that we are respectful of everyone's time today, and especially our presenter, Amy. So we are going to go ahead and get started. I'm just going to quickly introduce Dr. Vittor to all of you, and I'm very excited for you to see the presentation that she's prepared for you. So Dr. Amy Vittor serves as an assistant professor in the Division of Infectious Diseases and Global Medicine at the University of Florida and at the North Florida, South Georgia Veterans Health System. Dr. Vittor's research focuses on the nexus between vector-borne disease, land use, and host immunity. And really excited for the presentation that she has for you all today. We're going to hear her presentation, and then we should have a little time for question and answers as we wrap up, and we'll use the question and answer function here in Zoom for those questions. And then at the end, if you'll keep your eyes open on the chat, I'm going to post a link for you for an evaluation form. But if you miss it, we'll also send that to you via email. So welcome, Dr. Vittor.
Thank you so much, Lisa. And thank you all for joining today. I'm going to move over and share my slides. Let's see. And is that looking okay?
That looks great.
Okay. Okay, fantastic. Yes, I lament a little bit not being able to do this in real time in person and see the looks on your faces. That said, please do feel free to leave comments and any questions in the chat so we can make this somewhat interactive, hopefully, especially towards the end. So today, what I am going to be talking about then is sort of a combination overlap of multiple different things. So on the one hand, we have agriculture, and then within agriculture, I'm looking specifically at the role of agroforestry and regenerative agriculture and how that might impact farmers' health and ultimately the risk of zoonotic disease. So I'm coming at this, as Lisa kindly said, as someone who is firmly embedded in infectious disease as a doctor, but I've been doing mosquito-borne disease research for the last 20-something years. And as I've been doing this, trying to understand the ecology of mosquito-borne disease, it's become evident to me that agriculture has a very strong influence on where and how we find these mosquitoes and thereby the diseases that we see them with. So for that, that's kind of how I wound up looking at agriculture. And then the other slice of this is that there are a lot of initiatives now to try to mitigate climate change, to adapt to climate change. And one of them, very strikingly, is agroforestry as well as regenerative agriculture. And so it seemed like these forces are sort of hurling together. And I really wanted to understand how they might play with one another. Interestingly, I found zero information about that. And so hence the project. So the project is sponsored, by the way, by the Southeastern Coastal Center for Agricultural Health and Safety and the University of Florida. This one I'm talking about today is centered in North Florida, but we have a parallel project that's actually much larger in Panama to look at the same question. So this talk then, I'm going to really be much heavier on introduction and background on this topic and lighter on the ultimate results because the project is actually still ongoing. And as we speak, my laboratory technician is running some assays and I do not have those results yet. So I profusely apologize for not having the end of the story together. But like I say, it's a work in progress. So let me start off by just introducing this topic of zoonosis. So zoonoses specifically are infections that are transmitted from animals to humans. And actually, a good chunk of the known infectious diseases in us humans were acquired at some point, if not very recently, by animals. And, amongst those, we have, for example, dengue and chikungunya, but also HIV. And then furthermore, about 3/4 or so of emerging infectious diseases are thought to be derived from animals. So it's a very important mechanism of how infectious diseases emerge into our population. Once they do emerge into humans, first they spill over. So it's kind of an accidental infection, if you will, and it may not spread beyond that single individual. But over time, the pathogens may adapt to humans, and human to human transmission may become possible, like with HIV. There are many mechanisms that zoonoses can be contracted by. These include airborne. So, prime example could be avian flu, contaminated water and surfaces, and that includes things like cryptosporidium, for example, which is a diarrheal disease. Foodborne mechanisms include drinking infected milk, meat, or eggs, and amongst them we have, for example, salmonella and shigella. Um, Bites or saliva from animals is another major way. And in the ER, we always see people coming in with dog bites, cat bites, alligator bites, and the such. And that confers, of course, the risk of having bacteria embedded firmly within the tissues, but also rabies, for example. And then there's direct contact. This might come from um, just petting your animals. There aren't that many here, honestly, but one way, for example, Nipah virus is one that I'll briefly mention later. That virus is shed in the snot of pigs, and then you can directly come into contact with that and then acquire the disease. Another is vector-borne, and that includes, for example, mosquitoes and ticks. And so in that instance, you have a mosquito or tick that bites its normal host, which is not a human typically, and then we humans, we tread within their territory and accidentally get infected. That is that group of infections that I'm focused on in particular. So, why do we even think that agriculture plays a role here? So, this review was done, now it's dated, it's 14 years ago, but this review essentially looked at 1940 to 2005 and kind of tabulated all the emerging infectious diseases and categorized them roughly, and I really emphasize roughly, but it's the best we have by the mode by which it became an emergent disease. And so those modes include things like land use change, agricultural intensification, changes in the food industry, hunting for bushmeat, war, use of antimicrobial agents, variety of different things. But what I would like to focus on here is the green slice of that pie. So the dark green is land use change, lighter green is agricultural intensification, and we could include the yellow, which is sort of a vague category that they don't well define, consider to be food industry changes. So that really contributes a big chunk of potential reasons why diseases emerge. And so then it stands to reason that we should look closely at that, especially if we look at how agriculture has really shaped our planet. And from my understanding, the convention holds that agriculture started about 12,000 years ago. And I guess we Neolithic humans were puttering along, doing just fine in our small plots of, you know, farmland, and probably with lots of pastoralists herding cattle and whatnot. You can see on this x-axis here starts in 2000 BCE. So not much change in the use of the green, which is the grazing land, and the pink, which is cropland, over the course of millennia, actually. And it's really in the last 500 years, but especially in the last 100 or 200 years, that things explode. And another way to look at this and the change in the way we use the land is in this slide here. Now, here what we're looking at is a sort of honing in on the types of land use that we are engaged in. And so if we scope all the way out and look at the Earth's surface, only less than 30% is actually land, right? Of that 30% of Earth's surface, that is land, only 70% or so can be inhabited. The other chunk are things like Antarctica, where we really can't live. So of that habitable land, then, approximately half or so is used for agriculture, and the other half is wilderness of some sort, and it also includes cities. Now, when I poll my students about how much of the Earth's surface they think the habitable land is used for cities, they estimate typically 30%, 20%, sometimes even 50%. But actually, it's really just 1% that are used for cities and built up areas. Now, of the agricultural land then, a big chunk of it is used for livestock, about 3/4. And that then includes meat and dairy, but also is also land, for example, for corn, which is used ultimately for feeding the livestock. And then 1/4 or so is used for crops, for humans. And so that's actually quite striking. I think that kind of sets the tone for why we need to look at agriculture at all in relation to human disease. Um, so this is sort of a way to explain the mechanism by which landscape changes can give rise to outbreaks of disease. And in the case of vector-borne diseases, so mosquitoes, ticks, and the such, it's particularly important to keep in mind the landscape and also the climate, because these mosquitoes, even though it seems like they may be everywhere, um, they actually are not, especially the vectors of disease. They can be rather picky, interestingly, and they like particular landscapes and they like particular climates. So they like high moisture, high relative humidity, allows them to survive longer. They like moderate temperatures. Too hot is a problem. So over 40 degrees Celsius or so is really not great for vectors. But in that range, 25 degrees to 35 degrees Celsius, which is roughly what, about uh, like 75 to 100 degrees or so Fahrenheit is perfect for these guys. Now, the landscape is very important because these vectors usually have multiple different cycles where they need to feed on other animals, and those animals have distribution that is dependent on the landscape. Mosquitoes require a water body to breed in, and so those water bodies are very critical, and it can't just be any type of water body classically, and I'll go into that in a second. So when all these factors align and you have humans who are susceptible to the disease, then you might have good conditions for an outbreak to occur. This is a synthesis that Dr. Nathan Burkett-Cadena and I did a while back, where we looked at all the different mosquito species that were surveyed around the world in about 17 published studies by the degree of deforestation that had occurred in that region. And when we look at those mosquito species that were collected in all these different habitats around the world, what we noticed that was quite striking was that with increasing extent of deforestation, you have a concentration of mosquitoes that are good vectors of disease. Whereas in areas where there's predominantly forest and the forest is retained, in those instances, while there are tons of mosquitoes, those mosquitoes are not typically vectors of human disease. And that's depicted here on the left-hand side. If you look at the pink and the red bars, that indicates that the mosquito is known to be a vector for 1, 2, 3 diseases. So there is this very fascinating relationship that we've described and that many others have described between deforestation. But then if you stop to think about why are people deforesting? Well, by far and large is for the sake of agriculture. So what we also know is that as land use changes and we move away from wilderness and towards more human type habitats, we also lose much in biodiversity. And this is just a graphic depiction, not necessarily quantitatively accurate, but I think we all do understand the notion that as wilderness declines, so does biodiversity. This also turns out to have possibly an interesting impact on human disease. Which way it goes is not crystal clear, but the preponderance of literature suggests that as we decrease biodiversity of animals, we actually concentrate the pathogen. Because perhaps, for example, let's say a mosquito is more likely to bite mm, a fox, shall we say, in your yard. But the foxes are now gone. Well, that mosquito may now start biting you instead, and thereby concentrate the pathogen amongst humans. So there's a good body of literature to suggest that this might be happening. And so biodiversity is another mechanism by which land use change can impact human disease. So this association between agriculture and infectious disease has been very well described, and there are many, many, many examples, but predominantly in the tropics and subtropics, or shall we say, under-resourced countries. So, for example, there's a striking example of Nipah virus. Nipah virus is a virus that infects the brain and causes fatal encephalitis, and this was first seen to in Malaysia in around 1998. And at that time, the pig farmers were getting sick with this virus, and it was unknown what it was. Since then, it's gone on to actually continue to cause disease over and over, and even now, it even spreads human to human. So that's a rather scary instance of a zoonotic disease that now has become more sustained in the human population. Rift Valley fever is a virus that can be transmitted directly from cattle to cattle herders, or also via the bite of mosquitoes, and that occurs in East Africa. It causes hemorrhage and a bunch of nasty things. Avian flu is something that's on all of our radars now more than ever, and that's been shown to be circulating amongst poultry farmers at times in China, for example. These are just examples because truly there are numerous instances of each one of these pathogens amongst farmers around the world. Brucellosis is a bacteria that causes numerous things, heart infections, bone infections, and is known to occur in goat and cattle farmers. Again, around the world, actually here amongst hog farmers in Florida, we have plenty, relatively speaking, but in the Mediterranean, it's quite prevalent. Echinococosis is a parasite disease, worm, helminth, essentially, that is primarily affecting, for example, swine farmers. And Central Europe is one location, but there are multiple locations in the Middle East where Echinococcus sets up shop in humans by accident, if you will, and causes cysts in the liver. So there are many, many such examples. Much fewer are the examples, though, in more northern countries or countries with more temperate climates. And then even fewer are those which look at vector-borne disease. So I want to highlight, though, two studies that we've done in the past looking at the association between land use, agriculture, and vector-borne disease in the tropics. And one of them is malaria, to start with. So malaria is not a zoonosis, no, it's not a zoonosis, at least not now. It used to be, and there are currently zoonotic malarias as well. But the most common types of malaria are transmitted mosquito to human, back to mosquito, and then back to human, and on and on. But I bring this up because I think this is an interesting example of how agriculture impacts the way that vectors breed. And so what we're looking at here is our collections in forest sites and sites that are sort of shrub-like. So they were at one point deforested and they grow back. They're usually on the borders between farms and forests. And then there are areas that have been cleared. So I've term it grassland here. And the pies underneath demonstrate where the larvae are breeding of the mosquitoes that transmit malaria. So again, there are tons of mosquitoes, but only very few are good vectors of malaria. And the one that is demonstrated here in red. And so that small slice of the pie that is red, it's absent, completely absent in forest. But then when you go to shrub and grassland, it starts appearing. Then furthermore, when we look at the adult mosquitoes and how often they bite, we have this primitive way of doing this, where we actually sat down, bared our own legs, and sucked the mosquitoes off of our own legs to identify them. So using that method, what we discovered was that in forests, the mosquito is not there, in keeping with the fact that the larvae are not there. However, when we looked at the shrub and especially this more agricultural grazing land, cropland, that's where the mosquito is really present. So that's sort of a very clear example for us. That was an early clear example for me about how agriculture and the way we use our land can impact the risk of certain vector-borne diseases. And you can see the water quality is different in each location as well, and that's critical. So zoonotic vector-borne diseases, though, are different. They're much more complex. What you're looking at here on the left-hand side is that same cycle like with malaria, where you have human to mosquito to human. And those diseases include things that we also see here in Florida: dengue, chikungunya, Zika. We had outbreaks in 2014, 2015 of Zika and chikungunya. And dengue has has been here in Florida classically, but then vanished with all kinds of control efforts and returned in 2009 in Florida. And we've had it ever since. On the other hand, the middle and the right-hand diagrams demonstrate the zoonotic vector-borne infection, and this cycle is very complex, and there are many actors that we often don't really understand or know. So, we'll kind of merge these two circles into one, but essentially what you have here is a mosquito or a tick that predominantly feeds on a non-human and passes pathogens, which may or may not cause disease in that animal, back and forth to the species of that particular animal or those groups of animals. Then humans come along, and maybe we're living in the same space, maybe we're occupying the same space because we hunt or go for hikes, and then we get exposed. So it's those kinds of diseases that we're talking about here. So we looked at that particular type of disease in Panama, and we still are looking there. This is the Darien. Darien has become famous because it's a huge conduit for migrants from all around the world that actually on foot traverse the Darien Gap. So that's actually where we're located. And we've been looking at this encephalitis virus called Madariaga virus. We have the equivalent here, Eastern equine encephalitis virus. Really, it used to be considered the same virus, and now it's split out in different species, but it's very similar. And so needless to say, this causes brain infections, encephalitis. And in Panama, when I first got there around 2010, there was a big outbreak amongst children in particular who were affected by this virus. And then we started looking into the ecology and epidemiology of that virus. It turns out that it's mice, probably, that are the main hosts of this disease. And it's the mosquito mouse association that is the norm, most likely. So when we looked at where we found the mice that were most likely to be infected, what became clear was that especially pasture and cropland were high-risk areas. Now, that said, there's more movement here. So we found those mice to some smaller degree in forest, also in secondary growth, but mostly, like I mentioned, in pasture and cropland, and to some degree in village as well. And this we did by looking at the mice blood and testing it for the infection. And when you look up close, now this is a yellow fever kind of cycle, which is similar for the intents of this talk, but you can imagine how humans come into contact with these viruses very easily. I was staying in one of the houses there, woke up one morning, and I realized there's a howler monkey hanging outside right outside the house, hanging upside down, trying to get some mangoes. So we plant trees, humans, I say we, just as humans, oftentimes plant trees and crops near our house for convenience, for our own consumption. But it's not just us that consumes these crops, and anyone who grows anything around their home knows this, of course. Deer, squirrel, mice, they all get to it. But in this instance, it's a howler monkey trying to get to some mangoes. And then there's a container down right underneath that howler monkey, that blue container. That container is teeming actually of mosquitoes, because the mosquitoes are breeding in there. And it's the yellow fever mosquito, Aedes aegypti, that really enjoys that kind of habitat. So now humans have created sort of this perfect habitat, essentially, for a virus to now come much closer to them. So that's sort of the mechanism. And then seen another way, to really kind of demonstrate how agriculture plays a role here, is that oftentimes, when you talk about mice, for example, they have populations that boom and then they bust. So they reproduce very rapidly. There may be many of them, but then next thing you know, they're gone, and that's how kind of fickle their cycles can be. On the other hand, you have mosquito cycles too, and mosquitoes cycle through time in the same way. They emerge in vast numbers and then they may vanish for a long time. Now, those cycles may not overlap very well in wilderness type habitats. And that would then reduce the infection risk, because if they don't co-occur in time and space, then the chances of them transmitting pathogens becomes much less. However, in an agricultural setting, now the mice, for example, are able to persist much longer because now they have a persistent source of food. And so they stick around in high numbers. And the vector, the mosquito, may come and go, but now the chances of it actually coming into contact with that rodent become higher. So this is a theory that we're developing. There's some data behind this, but again, I'm just trying to demonstrate the different ways in which agriculture can influence and impact vector-borne disease risk. So again, now going back to the fact that there aren't that many studies that look at the more northern climes, there are some, certainly, and they're a little bit Mm, they don't always say the same thing. So in Northern Ireland, there's a small study back in 1990 where they tested farmers for different exposures, and sure enough, they were exposed to a bunch of things. That brucella that causes bone infections I mentioned, leptospira, Borrelia burgdorferi, which is a pathogen causing Lyme disease, Toxoplasma, Coxiella burnetii causes heart infections, Chlamydia psittaci, not a sexually transmitted disease. This one causes pneumonia. Hantavirus also causes bad pneumonias. So they found that these farmers had relatively high prevalences of all these. But then a study in the Netherlands looked at something similar in pig farmers and did not find high prevalences. So why might this be? I'm not sure. These are just kind of scattered reports. And then in Minnesota, there was an interesting study where they looked at people who worked and lived on farms with food production animals and compared them to regular non-farmer Minnesotans and found that there was a much higher risk of having gastrointestinal zoonotic diseases, so diarrheal disease basically, in those who worked on and lived on farms. Then there was a very notable epidemic in the Netherlands due to goat and sheep farming that occurred in 2007 to 2009, where about 4,000 people got sick with Coxiella, which I mentioned earlier, which the Dutch people did not find at that time, but later caused a huge outbreak. These people living in the farms, but also all around the farms, it was airborne actually, got sick with flu-like illness, but many instances also heart infections because of Coxiella. Um, so there are these scattered reports. I don't want to kind of go on with a list per se, but avian flu, hantavirus, these risks seem to be in some instances higher in farmers. But I really don't see much in the way of mosquito-borne risk. And so that's, again, why we're kind of looking at this. And Florida, this is particularly important because we have a whole bunch of mosquito-borne diseases here and tick-borne. And this is just kind of compiled the number of cases of West Nile, Eastern equine encephalitis virus, and the tick-borne ehrlichiosis here. And while Eastern equine encephalitis virus in red is very rare, it is one of the most fatal viruses that we know about. And the case fatality rate tends to be about 50%. So if you are known to have this, the chances that you'll die are probably about 50-50. And the chances that you'll end up with permanent brain damage are about 80+%. So it's quite devastating. West Nile virus, these are only the cases primarily that come to the attention of physicians because they're causing neuroinvasive disease, so encephalitis also. And it's really just the tip of the iceberg. The Ehrlichia, same kind of thing. So in the yellow triangles demonstrate the cases of Ehrlichia, tick-borne infection. A lot of people don't know about ehrlichiosis, but actually it's much more important than Lyme in our state. And Ehrlichia causes a febrile illness. It can cause liver abnormalities, also a type of meningitis, so infection of the lining of the brain. And this one can make you feel really terrible for weeks on end. And probably this also is just the tip of the iceberg that we're showing here. So there are more actually in Florida. So Florida also boasts other viruses like St. Louis encephalitis virus, Everglades virus, Tensas virus, Keystone virus. There is some Lyme as well. And there are other viruses, but they're not zoonoses, as I mentioned, that are mosquito-borne, tick-borne. This is really not an exhaustive list. These are the main ones. And then there are many other pathogens that are transmitted via other mechanisms, via contact, airborne, etc. But I think what's very notable immediately is the fact that we have a lot of mosquito-borne illnesses here. And I just want to highlight one that a couple of us over here are very fond of, and that's Everglades virus. Everglades virus is, as the name suggests, right, particular to Florida, probably not limited to the Everglades though. Um, so this one was discovered back in the 50s, and actually when they looked at Seminole reservations at the time, up to 12 to 84% of people had evidence of exposure. So when their blood was checked, they had antibodies to Everglades virus and very, very high numbers. Then no work was done for the longest time. And in 2004, a nice study looked at dogs and found that 4% of Florida dogs were positive, and actually the bulk of them were in the Gainesville, North Florida area. And then another study looked at bottlenose dolphins, and lo and behold, 9% of the bottlenose dolphins were positive. Now, this virus is transmitted by mosquitoes. So that kind of I had to pause there and say, why are dolphins positive? But actually, every time the dolphins are near the coast and come up for air, a mosquito could very well be waiting for them. There are pictures. I didn't include one here, but there are pictures of mosquitoes being bitten by dolphins being bitten by mosquitoes. So that just goes to show sort of how interconnected I suppose we are. So we're looking at this virus in this study as well. And this demonstrates here how Florida has changed its landscape. So kind of bringing in the agricultural piece now in Florida, I'm kind of zooming in. In the 1900s, it was nearly all wilderness, swamp-like and hard to develop. But of course, by the end of the 1900s, it was mostly developed. And the yellow represents crops and mixed farming. So there's lots of farming in Florida. Um, whoops. And is projected to, the development is projected to increase further. So by 2060, the orange, sorry for the fuzzy resolution here, but the orange represents developed land. And we all know that there's been quite an influx of people into Florida. And it's not for farming though. So farming in Florida might very well be on the decline, whereas housing and urban developments are on the rise. What that will do all said and done is anyone's guess. But anyways, now kind of looking at the farming piece. So I just wanted to introduce this agroforestry and regenerative agriculture topic. I'm not sure if those of you here are very familiar or not with these types of farming, but just in very brief, and I'm no expert by the way, so I'm going to qualify that right away, but agroforestry then is an ancient practice actually of deliberately interspersing trees with crops and or livestock, now modernized, if you will, in many locations. Regenerative agriculture, on the other hand, is a diverse farming practice, a group of practices that really has as its primary goal to promote soil health. And so, for example, avoiding tilling of the soil is a key component. And it's been identified that these kinds of practices can really enhance biodiversity and ecosystem integrity. Also, both practices are thought to mitigate climate change and help in adaptation to climate change. As of 2017, per a USDA survey, Florida had 803 farms that they noted incorporated agroforestry. The overall acreage was not that great, it's not that high, but it looks like a lot of people are sort of dabbling and certainly curious and engaging in this practice. And some may be very well engaged without even quite knowing that that's what they're doing because it's so natural to, for example, have a stand of pine trees adjacent to cattle ranching. Um, that does require actually some more level of deliberateness if you don't want your pine trees to get destroyed. Nonetheless, there are hedgerows that people plant, for example, that may constitute agroforestry. So anyways, these practices though are gaining some steam. Uh, okay, so in recent years, there's been an influx of cash to support farmers to engage in these practices, again, because of their climate beneficial impacts. And so actually to the tune of mm, um, Nature Conservancy alone received from the government about $60 million, I understand, to engage in this. And then the United Nations also has committed money, but also a lot of resources to developing agroforestry. So that's why it really came onto my radar. And in the places I've been working at, this is Panama, um, we have seen agroforestry in practice. A lot of indigenous people engage in this and have been for a millennia probably. And these are some of those practices. So you can have, for example, crops that are planted right around people's houses, and they may be interspersed with different species, different trees. A lot of times, in the first picture, there is some bare soil, but oftentimes there isn't bare soil. You may have livestock that are sort of grazing in between trees, and then coffee plantations famously use shade trees. That really helps the coffee crops. So these kinds of practices have been in place for a while. Here in Florida, these are some examples from local farms right here in Gainesville. Actually, we're near Gainesville. Nicoya Farm is Swallowtail, that very much promote these practices on their very own websites. So this then tries to sum up what we're looking at. So livestock and crop failure may occur due to extreme heat and drought. And one way to mitigate that then is by having more shade, for example. And that may spur people on to plant more trees or to retain the trees on their land. On the other hand, also, having these trees on their land mitigates climate change. So there's a possibly a very beneficial feedback loop there. On the other hand, though, what is that doing, that change in habitat to vectors and the host ecology? And this is kind of where I started scratching my head, because in Panama, what we really saw was it was those areas that had diverse types of trees, crops that seem to really promote a lot of rodent diversity and also mosquito diversity. So when we talk about biodiversity, oftentimes it's considered to be uniformly positive. However, what we experience was sometimes that diversity can be not so great for humans. I'm not really weighing in on what's good or bad here, but just kind of what we observed. So then, if that observation holds in this agroforestry type setting, it really does beg the question of what that might do for zoonotic disease transmission potential. And this is sort of a schema that we're using in Panama, but to a lesser degree here, where we're looking at these different types of agroforestry practices, and including silvopasture, silviculture, the use of trees for windbreaks and cover cropping. In contrasting that with the more so-called conventional methods, which may be open pasture, open monocropping, understanding though that all of this is on a continuum, and in practice, it's been very difficult to really divide one from the other. I'm going to skip this for the sake of time real quick. So here in Florida then, our aim, this is a small pilot grant, and it's been very exciting and very fun, I have to say. Our aims are twofold here. And number one is to determine the extent to which agricultural workers, and actually resident farmers, I should say, are exposed to zoonotic diseases, comparing the two types of practices, farming practices. And here our aim is to get 20 households or 20 farms in each of the two categories. We try to match them more or less by county and size. We're only using adults here, not children. And we obtain blood samples from the people we speak to. And then in the lab right now, we're developing assays to look at a whole host of different zoonotic vector-borne diseases, including some diseases that no one has looked at for a long time here in Florida, but that we know are here, like the Everglades virus, Tensol virus, for example. And then we're comparing it, the vegetations of each farming site, to kind of further look at the nuances of how vegetation plays into this. So the other aim then is to look at a more general self-reported metrics of health. And also their views on climate and temperature and how this plays a role. Their perceptions on febrile illness and vector exposures we query as well. And the aim here is really to be much more descriptive, because our numbers are small. The point here is to really kind of get a sense of what is out there, how people are experiencing their landscapes, how they're experiencing vectors, if at all. So this is a kind of a summary of the methods that we're employing. and we're driving out to those farms. And to be honest, that's actually super fun. It's been very, very illustrative and instructive to understand how people are living and farming, but it's slow going. So these are the farms that we've sampled so far, North Central Florida. And it's 14 farms, 16 farmers, 54 is the average age, and they're about 1/3 women and 2/3 men. When we look at the types of farming, understanding once again that the numbers are small, some engage in only livestock, fewer people engage in only crops, crop farming, but a big chunk also do both. And amongst those that farm only crops, so far, they're all certified organic. Amongst those that do livestock and or crops, about half or so practice agroforestry, and predominantly that consists of hedgerow trees, some pine forestry as well, and a lot of shade trees for cattle ranching in particular. Oops, wrong way. So it's very diverse though. These are the livestock that people are rearing, mainly cattle, but also hogs, goats, sheep, quail, bees and beekeeping, rabbits, chicken, ducks, geese, lots of different kinds of produce, including fruits and vegetables of all kinds. And then also pine, but flower, ryegrass, and clover too. Um, and this is sort of what it looks like. Let me introduce some other members of the team here. That's Chu Peng Wang on the left. He's a master's student who's doing his capstone project with us. And then that's me in the middle. And Athena Shaplowski is my undergraduate research assistant who's been instrumental in setting everything up. So now if we look at the types of landscapes surrounding these farms, the green represents grazing land, grass, yellow is crops, blue is trees, and red is built up area. And on the conventional farms, you see sort of 1/3, 1/3, 1/3 kind of thing. But in the agroforestry type locations, it's mostly trees. Interesting that the cropland acreage is actually kind of low. And then if we look at the tree loss, actually, interestingly, those areas that are agroforests have lost about 9% of their trees over the course of the last 6 years, compared to only about 4% of those that are more conventional. And maybe that's because they have more trees to lose, I'm not sure. So as far as what farmers are perceiving on the ground, the amount of mosquitoes that they perceived to be there was highly dependent on when we went. So when we started off in May, the mosquitoes weren't out much yet. It had been pretty dry, so they mostly said the mosquitoes were light. But then as the summer progressed and we entered August, the mosquitoes were considered to be heavy. And I think that's not it's probably just really the timing. About a quarter of folks had noticed that a tick had attached on them in the past week, and about a quarter of people had fevers in the past year, and most of them really had no clear explanation for the fever. The things that they did to reduce the mosquitoes and ticks included reducing standing water. Many of them used some kind of bug spray. Some folks stocked ponds with fish, mosquito fish. Some people had free range chicken, guinea fowl, which they noted eat the ticks in the ground. And then one rather large cattle rancher, very sophisticated one, fed his cattle insect growth regulator and sprayed chemicals in order to reduce the ticks on the cattle, though he did no such thing for himself. About 40, less than half of people worried about these zoonoses. The ones that they mentioned were Lyme disease, anthrax, rabies. One farmer said he got fowl pox from his chicken. I'm not aware of humans getting fowl pox, but it was an interesting thing to note. One child who had never traveled outside of her area in North Florida, where chikungunya is not known to be endemic, by the way, actually had chikungunya, and the mom showed me her test results from a reputable lab, and it was positive for chikungunya. That's a disease that was a pandemic in 2016 or so, went around the world. Not from here originally, so that was kind of odd. Another person noted that a friend tested positive for ehrlichiosis. No one themselves noted having ehrlichiosis. they said things like, it's hard to worry about stuff like that when you work out here. There's really nothing you can do about it. I never had any problem with it, so it doesn't pop into my mind very much. Others said, I don't think there's any way to get rid of it completely. Some worried about getting something from their meat, but they think about it, but don't do anything about it. And then several people voiced concern about their children. And then going into some of the climate questions, 56% of farmers felt that there had been a tendency towards higher heat over the past 20 to 30 years. And some people mentioned, for example, I feel myself getting stupid and clumsy and know it's time to take a break. Others said, I can't work between noon and 3 p.m. anymore. Others say, I feel affected more because of my health issues. Um, and then several people said it's not an issue. They said, I'm pretty attuned to it. I don't like it when it gets hot, but I can work through it. Then when we ask people whether heat exposure reduces the daily output or perhaps their livestock, their income, 56% said yes. And these were interesting comments. They said things like there are less crops, so less to sell and less income. Insurance costs have gone up, some noticed, possibly due to climate change and hurricanes and the such. Um, Another person said, I have to relocate the beehives in North Dakota in the summers because it's too hot for the bees to be productive here in Florida in the summer. Another person noted the blueberry season was cut in half this year because of the heat. Others said if the animals are too hot, they can't breed. And so many had installed heavy duty fans, for example, for hog breeding. Others just don't bother breeding in the summer. Others would freeze water and put it in their troughs to keep them cool. Others would say, I don't raise sheep or goats anymore because without the freeze here, the parasites never die. Um, One story included a turkey flipped over, got stuck, and died of heat exposure in the sun. Um, and then another person saw the silver lining, said climate change opens up more opportunities because now he can grow new crops that he couldn't before. So when we look then at some global physical and health scores, we did a survey, essentially elicited answers, and that was a very structured survey, which has been used in many different populations, and we know what in the US is considered to be within normal limits versus mild, moderate, or severely impaired. And so we were able to compare the farmers to that reference. And for their physical health, they were right about normal, like right in the 50th percentile. And for the mental health, maybe a little bit worse, but not severe. Um, Low numbers, which makes me really hesitate about showing you this, but if I break it out between those who practice conventional versus agroforestry, it's not that different, really, for either, for what that's worth. So now we need to complete the interviews. We are trying to expand our efforts by also adding virtual interviews and then sending people a self blood collection kit to their home so they can do it themselves and send it back. And we're hoping that that will help us recruit. But perhaps those of you who are on right now can also help out if you know anybody. Um, and then we're doing the assays that I mentioned. So to summarize then, we have kind of discussed how agricultural landscapes bring together disease vectors and livestock and humans all together in the same space and possibly the same time. And that then gives rise to the spillover effect. That right there accounts for a large portion of all the emerging infectious diseases. Um, and then when we look at the nitty gritty, it seems like these changes in landscapes, for example, give rise to new and different aquatic habitats, which for mosquitoes is critical and changes their whole composition. And then furthermore, there's changes in biodiversity. As I mentioned, yes, also loss of maybe fuzzy, cute creatures, but also changes and maybe improvements in mosquito biodiversity. Um, that part is a lot fuzzier. But the net effect seems to be that disease vectors are favored when we look at the deforestation study that Nathan and I did earlier on. Um, So, however, how agroforestry and regenerative agriculture influences this risk, we're still investigating. No answer there yet. In Panama, like I mentioned there, we're doing the same thing, but 400 households and over a large geographic area. So we're hoping to really kind of hone in on this question further. And the other thing that was interesting so far was that farmers have noticed changes in climate, about half-half, and it seems to actually have cost them. Um, to themselves, but also has cost them some income and has impacted the way that they farm. Future investigations, I think, might be very interesting, looking at extreme heat impacts on human and livestock immunity, for example. So that's in cattle, we know that their immunity is impacted by extreme heat. Humans, not so much, we don't really know. But if our immunity is impacted, then if there are diseases around, maybe we will be more susceptible. I don't know. And then finally, I'll just say once again, we really, really would love to recruit more farmers. So if you all know anybody or are interested, please contact us. And as I always forget, but I'm going to add it in the chat. I forget to add my information, but I'm going to put it right here in the chat, my email. If you know anybody or you yourself are interested or would like to inquire about anything else, my email is in the chat and please do reach out. So finally, I would like to say thank you to the team, as well as Rayu Poo, who's in the lab, not depicted here, and Drs. Glenn Morris, Farah Rosamena, Ashley, Maura McLeod, and actually Lisa and Ricky, who are on here as well, who are tremendous drivers of the Southeastern Coastal Center, which has allowed this to happen in the first place. And we'll shout out to people in Peru from that malaria study from long ago, and the people in Panama, big teams over there. That's Scott Weaver, my one of my fantastic mentors from a while back, the arboviral giant, and then John Paul next to him, who is my steadfast collaborator of 12 years. So that's it, folks. Thank you so much. I am going to stop sharing and see if you have any questions.
All right. Thank you so much, Dr. Vittor. That was fascinating. I know I really enjoyed it, and I'm sure that our attendees have as well. I just want to welcome those of you who are in attendance to ask any questions that you have of Dr. Vittor. You can put those in the Q&A box, or if you want to in the chat is fine as well. And we'd be happy to take your questions. I'm also going to put a link to our evaluation form in the chat and would love for you to take a few moments and just give us some feedback, because we want to make sure that we have more of these fantastic webinars to serve you all. So I've put that there, and I'll open it up to any questions that you all may have. I have a couple, but I want to give you all a chance to ask your questions. So maybe I'll kick us off with one while people are taking a minute to think about it. Dr. Vittor, I was curious because you showed the example in some of the Florida farms examples of cover crops. And so I was interested in if we have farmers or people in attendance, know farmers who are interested in expanding agroforestry on their property, what advice do you have about the benefits of cover crops versus trees, or a mix of the two? I guess, what guidance might you give folks?
Well, as I pointed out in the beginning, I am no agroforestry expert. I am learning this as I go myself. However, there are many of those who are. And actually at University of Florida, we have a now retired expert, worldwide expert. His name is Dr. P.K. Nair, who has studied this issue all around the world. So we have great resources within IFAS as well. And now actually it's the Nature Conservancy that is in charge of the $60 million that is funding people. It just solicited applications from those who might want to engage in agroforestry to apply. And I think they might do several rounds in case anyone's interested. As far as trees, and there are all kinds of nuances. And so, for example, growing pine trees and having pasture in between is one strategy. The hogs or cattle can then graze on the pasture in between the trees, but that requires a lot of finesse. And so from what I understand, those trees do have to be a certain height, or else the animals will just push them over and you might lose them. With hurricanes, also some of the pine stands have gone down, which is another element of challenge. The cover crops you mentioned, well, perhaps that falls more within the regenerative agriculture world to some degree, to never basically leave the soil bare. And I understand there are lots of great cover crops that put nitrogen in the soil, for example. I've seen some people use peanuts But again, I hesitate to say too much because while I am fascinated, I am not an expert in in those particulars.
Okay. Yeah, it's a great suggestion. Just if folks themselves or if they know somebody who wants to expand in this area, we have some great experts at UF that can be helpful in figuring out what's right for your particular landscape. See, I don't see any questions thus far in our Q&A. I have one other question for you that I thought of. I know you were talking about, I love the data breakdown that you gave us of all the different land uses towards the beginning. And I know you said cities are actually a very small percentage. But as I know in Florida, we have a lot of places where we have kind of the rural urban interface. What have you seen, or just kind of your experience in Florida and in other places of what the transmission looks like in those places where you have the rural and the urban coming together?
Hmm. Trying to kind of picture this in my mind. In some ways, I lived exactly in that interface, I would say. And it's kind of funny because I was able to do some of my studies on our land, trapping mosquitoes, trapping rodents. So they exist, and it's kind of in ecology, it's called an ecotone, where you have that border area. And those ecotones are very known to be diverse. And so you have specifically, you have, for example, you have animals that might be in more rural landscapes. It could be, shall we say, forests, for example, right? So they have their own set of invertebrates and vertebrates. And then adjacent to that, in an urban landscape, you might have a whole nother set of vertebrates and invertebrates. But then on that border, they actually come into physical contact where normally they wouldn't. And it's exactly that sort of opportunity that may give rise to pathogens jumping from one host to another host that they normally would not encounter. So the more edge you have, we do know this, that this edge effect is important, and it does seem to promote a pathogen diversity. That is a type of diversity that we're not really longing for.
Yeah. Okay.
Here in
We have
Florida.
one comment that's popped up in our Q&A from Christine related to the cover crops. Christine says, our cover crops in my community garden have helped us reduce our weed pressure. We use Thai long bean as a summer cover crop and grow cruciferous vegetables in the winter. So thank you for that, Christine.
Sounds lovely. Yeah, I think I have an actual secret, great admiration of people who grow crops and farming. This is part of why I do it, because it's so wonderful to see what's out there and see what you're all doing to create food for the rest of us.
I was particularly interested in your mosquito data collection, and I thought if you'd like me to, anytime I slap mosquitoes on my leg, I can collect them for you.
No longer considered okay, apparently. It's an antiquated method.
That's good. I'm glad for you and your team.
Yeah, also, Lisa, I think you're probably too valuable to be subjected to all kinds of pathogens that are out here.
Well, this is fascinating work, and I really appreciate you taking time to share it with us. And again, for those of you participating, thank you to Dr. Vittor for sharing her email in the chat. And I know she's welcomed any follow-up, or if you have people that you know of that would be willing participants, we certainly want to grow this research and grow this knowledge base specifically to Florida agriculture. So